It's no secret that the Ndebele people of Zimbabwe and the Shona people of Zimbabwe never really liked each other for a very long time. In fact, some of them still hate each other today. But why? Historically speaking, Zimbabwe's early independence years hide one of the most painful and least discussed chapters of Southern African history. Because after independence in 1980, the fighting didn't actually end. It just changed directions. In order for you to understand what actually happened next, you need to understand the two movements that helped to free Zimbabwe, but later turned on each other. Before independence, Zimbabwe's liberation struggle was led by two main parties, ZANU and ZAPU. One was Zimbabwe African National Union, and the other one was Zimbabwe African People's Union. And both of these parties were fighting white minority rule in what was then called Rhodesia. Well, both of these parties were not the same. So just like in South Africa, where the ANC had an armed wing called the MK, well, with ZANU, they had an armed wing called ZANLA. And with ZAPU, they also had an armed wing called ZIPRA. I know it sounds very confusing, but stay with me. So you got ZANU, Zimbabwean African National Union, and ZAPU, Zimbabwean African People's Union. ZANU had an armed wing, basically soldiers, that was called ZANLA, and ZAPU had an armed wing called ZIPRA. And now it's important to know that even though both groups were fighting white minority rule, they were still divided in terms of their politics, their beliefs, and their identity and strategy as well. So ZANU was mainly made up of Shona people, whereas ZAPU was mainly made up of Ndebele people. On the one hand, you have Robert Mugabe, a school teacher turned revolutionary who rose to lead ZANU, and he drew massive support from the mainly Shona-speaking communities. On the other hand, you had Joshua Nkomo, a veteran nationalist, a trade unionist, and the leader of ZAPU. He was well respected. Some even called him the father of Zimbabwe, or Umafukufuku. And now ZAPU had strong support in Ndebele land amongst the Ndebele-speaking communities, although it was not only limited to them. You had Xhosa, Tonga, Sotho also supporting ZAPU at that time. And these tribes that I mentioned were based in Zimbabwe, not the ones in South Africa. I know it's confusing, but stick with me. So while both leaders were fighting against colonial rule, a political struggle was already brewing under the scenes. And as you can see, the Shona people called Joshua Nkomo Chibwe Chitedza, which means slippery rock. And I don't think that was a good thing. Now, here's where tension started to rise. So in 1980, Zimbabwe finally receives its independence, and Robert Mugabe becomes the prime minister, and Joshua Nkomo is made the minister of home affairs. But now one of the biggest problems was, how do you merge two opposing enemy armies into one national military? Now, some of the former ZANLA fighters and the ZIPRA fighters were put into an integration camp. So now these guys were now waiting for formal training. I believe this was going to come from the English. So now at this point, these were armed men from opposing enemy camps, just waiting with nothing else better to do. At this point, some mistrust grew. Some of the guys started to mistreat other guys based on tribal lines and political parties and so forth. Now this is where we introduce the dissidents. So apparently in some parts of the country, some of these guys grew bored of waiting, and they decided to go around and start terrorizing civilians, stealing from them, taking advantage and so forth. So now the government saw this as a security threat. And who could blame them? If you look at the neighboring countries, a bunch of men running around with guns was never a good thing in Africa. But what happened next, no one was prepared for, because things became bloody. In 1980, a special army unit was formed. It was called the 5th Brigade. Mugabe and the former government of North Korea and President Kim Il-sung made a deal, and about 3,000 to 4,000 Zimbabwean soldiers were trained. And I'm talking special training. These guys were not trained like the regular army back in Zimbabwe. So they were trained for some time, and then they were not integrated into the national army itself. They were a separate unit. They were very distinct, and they answered to nobody but the highest levels of government. Basically, the only answer to the Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe. And these guys were now deployed in Ndebele land. And in Mugabe's own words, he said, any parts of the country that were experiencing, terror from these so-called dissidents, that's where he would send this specially trained unit. This unit's first commander was known as Parents Shiri, and they were deployed in Ndebele land and parts of Midlands as well. And what followed next would become one of Zimbabwe's darkest periods post-independence. This operation would be code-named Gukuraundi. It's a Shona word that means the early rain that washes away the chaff. Initially, the government had said that the main targets were these dissidents or rogue soldiers, but in practice, civilians were affected as well. Women were harassed and innocent men were killed, and countless more were severely beaten. In fact, there are even some stories that say these soldiers would round up people and force them to sing in this strange Shona language while beating them as well. Their houses were torched and some people were burnt alive as well. The people of Ndebele land and other neighboring communities really went through a dark period in this time, and they felt the government's wrath. This period was also filled with major human rights violations. Reports from human rights organizations estimated the deaths from several thousands to about 20,000. But in reality, many people say that it might have been even up to 50,000 people who had been slaughtered and killed during that period. So during this time, the leader of ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo, had to flee the country for his own safety. But then in 1987, the two parties decided to merge. So ZAPU and ZANU basically merged together, therefore becoming ZANU-PF. Now, many people say that the leader of ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo, only chose to basically merge with ZANU because the death toll kept on rising, and it was basically for the safety of his own people as well. This is now known as the Unity Accord, a chapter in one of Zimbabwe's most bloodiest periods post-independence. For many people, Gukuraundi remains one of the most sensitive topics in Zimbabwe. For some, it was just simply a security operation, but for others, it was a national tragedy. But what we do know is that the fight for independence in Zimbabwe never really ended in 1980. And today we can still see the ripple effects of such a fragmented government.